My brothers and sisters, September 23rd, 2025 will be remembered as the day the Muslim world sent a message that shattered every assumption about global leadership. When the Organization of Islamic Cooperation officially nominated me for the Nobel Peace Prize, they weren't just recognizing one African leader's work. They were declaring that Islamic nations would no longer accept Western definitions of peace and progress. The announcement from Secretary General Ibrahim in Jeddah carried unprecedented weight. It declared that Ibrahim Traoré represents the authentic voice of Islamic solidarity with oppressed peoples worldwide. My transformation of Burkina Faso through agricultural revolution, educational reform, and genuine reconciliation was framed as embodying the highest principles of Islamic governance. Within hours, 57 Islamic nations had endorsed this nomination, creating the most unified Muslim political action in decades. But this was never just about rewarding my efforts in Burkina Faso. It was about the Muslim world finally asserting its own values against a global system that had long marginalized Islamic perspectives. The timing shook New Delhi. Just weeks earlier, India had pressured me to abandon the Pakistan-Saudi defense alliance, threatening to cancel $71 billion in deals unless I chose between Indian partnerships and Islamic solidarity. The Muslim world responded decisively. They chose me as their candidate for the world's most prestigious peace prize. Overnight, India's carefully built strategy of presenting itself as the leader of the global South collapsed, as the unity of 57 Islamic nations shattered that narrative. Pakistan's foreign minister was the first to congratulate me, declaring that true leadership means standing with the oppressed regardless of pressure from major powers. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman praised Africa for producing a leader who embodies justice, mercy, and resistance to oppression, citing my defense of Palestine and transformation of Burkina Faso as proof that Islamic principles can guide modern governance. The Iranian president hailed my commitment to the anti-imperial struggle, while Turkey's Erdogan called me the future of Islamic leadership. Independent, principled, and unafraid of superpower pressure. It was the coordination of this support that truly alarmed Indian strategists. This wasn't scattered praise. It was the Islamic world speaking with one voice, validating a leader who had rejected Indian coercion. Indian media panicked. Headlines screamed that the Muslim world had turned its back on India, and television debates raged over whether New Delhi had lost Islamic support forever. The OIC citation made it worse for India. It highlighted my refusal to compromise Islamic solidarity for economic gain, a direct rebuke to Indian ultimatums. It praised my defense of Palestine despite Western pressure, a reminder of my UN speech that had angered Israeli allies, including India. The nomination positioned me as the Islamic world's answer to India's regional ambitions, where Modi offered economic partnerships with political strings. I embodied principled leadership guided by faith and justice. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. From Cairo to Cape Town, Muslim communities celebrated an African leader being elevated as the voice of Islamic solidarity. Even the African Union, which had once isolated my government after the 2022 coup, suddenly found itself forced to defend my recognition on the world stage. President Traoré's Nobel nomination was hailed as proof that true leadership is measured by results, not by the path one takes to power. The AU Commissioner for Political Affairs declared that his transformation of Burkina Faso and his unwavering commitment to Pan-African unity deserved global recognition. Across the continent, leaders began rethinking their stance on Islamic partnerships. If the Muslim world could honor an African leader who placed solidarity above India's economic incentives, then perhaps there were genuine alternatives to the development models imposed by major powers. The economic ripple effects were immediate. Islamic development banks moved quickly, announcing expanded partnerships with Burkina Faso, free of the political strings tied to Indian deals. The Islamic Development Bank pledged $8 billion for Sahel development, explicitly citing Traoré's leadership as their reason for confidence. At the same time, Indian businesses operating in Muslim countries began to feel the squeeze. Trade delegations delayed, investments reviewed, cultural exchanges quietly cancelled. The message was unmistakable: economic ties now carried political consequences. Even the Vatican's earlier endorsement of Traoré's candidacy gained new weight. Pope Francis had praised his efforts to turn weapons into tools of farming, hatred into hope. Now the Islamic world echoed the same sentiment. Two of the world's largest faith communities were united in recognizing leadership that placed human dignity above political convenience. This interfaith consensus sent a powerful signal. Moral and spiritual authority were rising as counterweights to raw economic leverage. Western reactions, though cautious, revealed a shift in perception. European leaders, who once dismissed Traoré for his military background, now praised his pragmatic peacebuilding. U.S. officials spoke approvingly of his reconciliation with former militants. Their tone reflected a growing realization. Unity across the Islamic world behind his nomination marked a geopolitical realignment too significant to ignore. If 57 nations could coordinate in rejecting Indian economic coercion, what else could they unite on? The nomination also vindicated Traoré's broader strategy of rejecting dependence on great powers in favor of principled partnerships rooted in shared values. Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution, grounded in Islamic principles of land stewardship and community solidarity, had secured food independence and inspired other nations. His Farmers of Peace program turned ex-militants into contributors to society, a living example of Islamic redemption and second chances. Most telling was his refusal to apologize for defending Palestine or to abandon Islamic solidarity for economic rewards. His survival and success proved that principled leadership could withstand and outlast superpower pressure. The Nobel nomination was more than recognition. It was the Islamic world's declaration that such leadership deserved celebration. By late September, the deeper meaning was undeniable. India's strategy had collapsed under its own weight. Attempts to use economic leverage to dictate African foreign policy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing Traoré to choose between Indian partnerships and Islamic solidarity, Modi's threats had united the Muslim world behind an African leader who embodied everything India was not: principled, independent, and unafraid. The Peace Prize would not be announced until October, but the verdict was already written. The Muslim world had chosen its candidate, and in doing so, its values: solidarity over submission, principle over profit, dignity over dependency. For India, the lesson was harsh. Economic power without moral authority breeds resistance, not respect. Threats create alternatives, not compliance. In today's multipolar world, no single power can force nations to abandon their values in exchange for survival. The Islamic world's nomination of Ibrahim Traoré for the Nobel Peace Prize was more than a recognition of one leader's achievements. It was a declaration of independence from the idea that economic dependency must mean political submission. It proved that the global South has choices, that dignity can prevail over dollars, and that solidarity can outweigh coercion. When 57 nations unite behind a single candidate, the message surpasses individual recognition. It is a vote for a new kind of leadership, leaders who plant fields instead of exploiting them, who defend the oppressed instead of appeasing the powerful, who measure progress in schools and healed communities, not in signed contracts and weapons stockpiles. The nomination was not just for me. It was for leadership that feeds children before feeding superpowers, that rebuilds enemies into farmers of peace, and that puts principle above profit. Whether the Nobel Prize is awarded to me or not, the Islamic world has already granted me the greatest honor: their trust that Africa can lead with integrity, their confidence that principled leadership can endure against economic pressure, and their belief that justice will define the future, not convenience. The implications spread far beyond diplomacy. Islamic financial institutions began aligning their investments with values, rewarding nations that stood in solidarity with Muslim causes. The Islamic Development Bank launched a 15 billion dignity fund to support leaders who put principle before submission. Leaders across Asia echoed this vision. Malaysia's Anwar Ibrahim declared that prosperity and principles need not conflict, while Indonesia's Joko Widodo hailed Africa for giving the Islamic world a leader who turned conflict into cultivation, hatred into harvest. The ripple effects were felt across societies. Civil organizations in all 57 Islamic nations coordinated new support for African projects modeled on Burkina Faso's initiatives. The International Islamic Relief Organization pledged to replicate the Farmers of Peace program across conflict zones. Universities joined the movement. Islamic institutions announced joint research on what they now called the Traoré Model of post-conflict reconstruction. The Islamic University of Medina went further, creating a Department of Applied Islamic Governance with my reforms as its foundation. The symbolism was immense. Islamic scholarship was formally recognizing that authentic leadership could rise from unlikely places through unconventional paths and be judged by results rather than credentials. India, meanwhile, scrambled. Strategic analysts issued panicked reports warning the New Delhi had lost the Islamic narrative to Africa. One report admitted that India's transactional diplomacy looked shallow compared to the principled solidarity championed by African leadership. Recommendations for more cultural outreach and religious diplomacy only underscored the depth of the miscalculation. The nomination also accelerated debates about reforming global institutions to reflect the priorities of the global South. If the Muslim world could unite behind one African candidate, what else could they unite to change? The precedent had been set. Religious and cultural communities could wield their values as power against purely economic systems. European officials privately admitted their unease. The Islamic world's unity behind my candidacy was a rejection of Western-dominated structures, and worse, a demonstration that alternative values could build alternative power. The Chinese response stood in sharp contrast to India's panic. Beijing welcomed the nomination, stressing their respect for principled leadership that put people's welfare above outside pressure. For China, supporting Islamic unity around values-driven leadership fit neatly into their broader strategy of creating alternatives to Western dominance. Russia was even more blunt. President Putin declared that true strength comes from serving your people, not foreign interests, and that my nomination reflected the world's growing recognition of authentic leadership. The difference was unmistakable. Where Beijing and Moscow saw my success as part of their wider challenge to Western hegemony, New Delhi saw only a threat to its narrow regional ambitions. As September closed, opinion polls across Islamic countries revealed something historic: widespread support for African leadership in global affairs. In Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, and beyond, majorities expressed confidence that African leaders understood their struggles better than traditional great powers ever had. This shift created pressure on governments to align policies with public sentiment, prioritizing principled solidarity over transactional deals. The Nobel nomination had evolved into more than recognition for an individual achievement. It became a referendum on the future of South-South cooperation, Islamic unity, and resistance to economic coercion. Whether the Nobel Committee ultimately chose me was uncertain, but the Islamic world had already chosen its path: authenticity over accommodation, principle over profit, dignity over dependency. For India, the lesson was unmistakable. Economic leverage without moral authority breeds resistance, not respect. Their failed attempt to corner me into abandoning solidarity proved how quickly coercion can backfire. The announcement of September 23rd will be remembered not just as a nomination, but as the day the Islamic world declared independence from the old assumption that economic ties must equal political submission. It marked the birth of a new era, value-based cooperation that rose above great power calculations. My brothers and sisters, the true honor was never the nomination itself, but what it symbolized. 57 nations standing together to affirm that leadership means serving principles greater than power, building communities stronger than contracts, and choosing justice over convenience, no matter the cost.